September 1944. The war in Europe had changed. The glorious sun-drenched days of liberating Paris were over. The newsreels back home showed cheering crowds and kissing girls. But on the front lines, the reality was grim. The summer was dead, and with it, the speed of the American advance had died too. The skies over the Lorraine region of France were not just gray. They were a heavy, oppressive blanket of slate that seemed to crush the earth below. It rained every single day. A cold, miserable, bone-chilling drizzle that seeped into everything. It turned the dirt roads of France into rivers of thick, sucking glue. It was the kind of mud that swallowed boots, it swallowed jeeps, and it bogged down the entire Third Army. General George Patton, old blood and guts himself, was furious. His army, the army that was supposed to race to Berlin, was stuck. They were running out of gas, they were running out of ammo, and they were running straight into the teeth of a desperate, hardened German defense. The Germans weren't running anymore, they were digging in. They were hiding in the dense, fog-shrouded forests. They were turning every ruined farmhouse into a fortress, and they had brought their monsters with them to understand the sheer courage, the absolute insanity, of what Charles Carpenter was about to do. You first have to understand the thing he was fighting. You have to understand the Tiger, the Panzerkampfwagen 6, to the average American soldier, shivering in a waterlogged foxhole with a wet cigarette. The Tiger wasn't just a tank. It was a myth. It was a ghost story made of 60 tons of hardened nickel steel. Imagine a machine that weighs twice as much as your own tank. Imagine a machine with frontal armor that is 100 millimeters thick, 4 inches of face hardened steel plate. You could hit it with a standard American 75 millimeter shell, and it would just bounce off like a pebble hitting a granite wall. The American crews watched in horror as their shells shattered against the German steel, leaving nothing but a scratch on the paint. But the armor wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was the gun, the 88mm KWK-36 cannon. It was a weapon originally designed to shoot down high-flying bombers, adapted to kill tanks. It was precise, it was devastating, and it had a range that defied belief. It could put a shell through the front of a Sherman tank from 2,000 yards away. That is over a mile. Most American tank crews never even heard the shot that killed them. They would be driving along, scanning the tree line, and then darkness, a sudden, violent explosion that turned their tank into a crematorium. The Tiger was the apex predator of the battlefield. The Americans called it the Iron Coffin. The Germans just called it invincible. Whenever a Tiger engine roared to life in the distance, a deep, guttural, mechanical growl that shook the earth, a wave of terror would spread through the American lines. It was a phenomenon known as Tiger Panic. Men froze, commanders screamed for air support. No one, absolutely no one, wanted to face that beast on the ground. But high above this industrial slaughter, floating silently, almost drifting like a dead leaf on the wind, was something the Germans didn't fear. It wasn't a P-51 Mustang, with its screaming Merlin engine, hunting for dogfights in the clouds. It wasn't a jagged P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy with 500-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets. It was a kite, a tiny, fragile, high-wing monoplane, buzzing along at a pathetic 70 miles per hour. It was an L-4 Grasshopper, to the battle-hardened German veterans looking up from their turrets. It was the biggest joke of the war. It was a toy. It wasn't even a real plane. It was made of a welded steel tube frame, covered in nothing but doped linen fabric and plywood. Think about that for a second. Fabric. You could punch a hole through the fuselage of that plane with your bare fist. It had no armor plate. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It had no heavy machine guns. It had a tiny, 65 horsepower engine. Basically a lawnmower engine with a wooden propeller. A single German soldier, standing in a field with a standard Mauser rifle, could bring it down with one lucky shot. A burst from a machine gun would turn it into confetti. A hit from a flak cannon would vaporize it instantly. The German tank commanders would pop their heads out of their hatches, look up at the little olive-drab plane putting along the tree line, and they would laugh. They wouldn't even waste an anti-aircraft shell on it. Why bother? It was harmless. It was just a scout, a flying pair of binoculars, a nuisance. But not a threat. They would wave at it. They would mock it. They knew that the pilot inside could see them, and they knew he couldn't do a damn thing about it, but they were wrong, dead wrong, because the pilot of that tiny plane was not a normal pilot, and inside that fragile cockpit, a fire was burning that was hotter than any engine. Major Charles Carpenter was 32 years old. In the world of fighter pilots, where 20-year-olds were considered veterans, Carpenter was an old man. He was Pops. He was the old man in his civilian life, Before the world went mad. He wasn't a killer, he was a history teacher. He lived in a small town in Urbana, Illinois. He taught kids about the Civil War, about the Founding Fathers, about the cost of freedom. He was also a football coach. He was a man who molded minds, a man who taught sportsmanship, a man who taught fair play, but war changes men. It strips away the layers of civilization and reveals what is underneath. When the war started, Carpenter didn't want to teach. He didn't want to sit on the sidelines. He wanted to fight. He wanted to fly the big fighters. He wanted to be in a Mustang or a Thunderbolt, dueling with the Luftwaffe in the clouds. But the Army Air Force took one look at his age and his medical records and said, no. They told him he was too old for combat. They told him his reflexes weren't sharp enough for dogfighting. They told him he could fly, but only the liaison planes, the L-4s, the Maytag Messerschmitts, the flying bicycles. His job was simple and dangerous. He was an artillery spotter. His job was to fly low, slow, and draw fire. He had to find the German positions, radio the coordinates back to the artillery batteries miles behind the lines, and then run away before the Germans swatted him out of the sky. He was bait. The target, he was a spectator when Carpenter arrived in France in 1944. The reality of his job hit him hard. It wasn't the danger that bothered him. It was the helplessness every day. Rain or shine, he would take off from a muddy airstrip. He would fly over the battlefield. He would look down through the thin plexiglass windows, and he would see hell on earth. He saw American boys, 18, 19 years old. Boys the same age as his students back in Illinois, getting cut to pieces in the mud. He saw German panzer tanks ambushing Sherman columns. He saw infantrymen pinned down by machine gun fire, screaming for help that couldn't reach them. He saw the enemy moving freely. The German tankers knew the L-4 couldn't hurt them. They would drive their tanks right out in the open. Arrogant, untouchable. They treated the battlefield like their own backyard, and Carpenter, drifting 200 feet above them, could do nothing. He had a pistol on his belt, that was it. He couldn't drop a bomb, he couldn't strafe them, he could only watch. He felt like a spectator at a gladiator match where his friends were being slaughtered. He wrote in a letter home, "I am flying a front row seat to the war, but I can't join the game." The frustration ate at him. It kept him awake at night. It burned in his gut like acid. He hated the feeling of being useless. He hated the arrogance of the German tankers. He wanted to wipe those smiles off their faces. He wanted to hit back. But how? He was flying a kite with an engine. The engineers had made it very clear. The L-4 had a maximum payload capacity that was barely enough for the pilot and a radio. If he carried a bomb, the plane wouldn't take off. If he mounted a heavy machine gun, the recoil would rip the fabric wings apart. It seemed impossible. The manual said it wasn't allowed. The regulations said it couldn't be done. The laws of physics said it shouldn't work. But Charles Carpenter was a history teacher, and he knew that history is made by men who break the rules. He was a football coach, and coaches don't give up when they are down. They find a play that works. One evening, after a particularly bloody battle, Carpenter was walking through the mud at the airfield. The rain was drizzling down, cold and gray. He was tired. He was angry. His flight suit was damp. He walked past a group of infantrymen from the 4th Armored Division. They were huddled under a canvas tarp, cleaning their weapons near a jeep. They looked exhausted. Their uniforms were caked in mud and blood. They were smoking cigarettes, trying to stay warm. Carpenter stopped. His eyes locked onto something lying on a wooden crate next to them. It was a long, ugly, steel tube about 5 feet long, painted olive drab. It looked like a piece of plumbing pipe. It looked simple, crude. But Carpenter knew what it was. The M1 Bazooka, the infantry's equalizer. It fired a 2.36-inch rocket. It wasn't a bullet. It was a shaped charge. It didn't need a heavy barrel or a complex firing mechanism. It didn't have massive recoil like a cannon. The rocket did all the work when it hit a target. It focused all its explosive energy into a single jet of molten metal that could burn through 3 inches of solid steel armor. 3 inches. Carpenter stopped in his tracks. He stared at the bazooka. He looked at the rocket. Then, he turned his head and looked at his parked plane, the L-4 Grasshopper. He looked at the fragile wing struts, made of thin aluminum. He looked at the fabric skin, stretched tight over the wooden ribs. A light bulb went off in his head. A crazy, reckless, stupid idea. An idea that would get him court-martialed if it failed, and maybe killed even if it worked. He walked over to the infantrymen. The soldiers looked up, surprised to see a major standing there in the mud. "Sergeant," Carpenter asked, pointing a gloved finger at the bazooka. "How much does that thing weigh?" The sergeant looked confused. He picked up the tube. "About 13 pounds, Major, maybe 15 with a rocket loaded. Why do you ask, sir?" Carpenter didn't answer immediately. He was doing the math in his head. 13 pounds times 2, maybe times 4 or 6, 60 to 80 pounds of extra weight. The plane would be heavy, it would be sluggish, the center of gravity would shift, the aerodynamics would be ruined, but it would fly. A slow, dangerous smile spread across the history teacher's face. "I think," he said softly, "I think I can strap that to my plane." The sergeant laughed. He thought the major was joking. "Sir, you want to shoot that out the window?" "No," Carpenter said. "I want to mount it under the wing. I want to turn that scout plane into a fighter." To understand the sheer insanity of what happened next, you have to understand the gap between a man's desire to fight and the cold, hard reality of the machine he is flying. Charles Carpenter was not a suicidal man. He was a rational human being. He was a history teacher who graded papers on weekends. He was a father. He valued his life. But as the days turned into weeks in the rainy, mud-soaked September of 1944, something inside him began to break. The frustration was like a physical weight on his chest. Every morning, before the sun even broke through the fog, he would climb into his L-4 Grasshopper. He would smell the damp canvas, the spilled oil, and the cold metal of the cockpit. He would take off into the gray sky, flying low over the hedgerows of France, and every morning, without fail, he would see the same nightmare. He saw American boys, 18, 19 years old, pinned down in muddy ditches, screaming for medics who couldn't reach them. He saw the muzzle flashes of German machine guns firing from stone barns. He saw the terrifying silhouette of panzer tanks moving through the fog like sharks in dark water. And he could do nothing. He had a radio. He could call for artillery, but artillery was blunt. It was imprecise. It took time. By the time the shells landed, the Germans were often gone, or the Americans were already dead. He could call for the P-47 Thunderbolts, but the weather was often too bad for the fast fighter bombers to fly safely. Carpenter was alone. He was a spectator in a slaughterhouse. He found his crew chief, Staff Sergeant Chester Hackleton, in the maintenance tent. Hackleton was a veteran mechanic. His hands were permanently stained with grease. He knew planes inside and out. He knew what they could do, and more importantly, what they could not do. Carpenter walked in, carrying the bazooka he had borrowed from the infantry. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of gun oil. He slammed it down on the wooden workbench. The metallic clang made everyone in the tent jump. "Sergeant," Carpenter said, his voice serious, low, and dangerous, "I want you to strap this to my plane." Hackleton looked at the bazooka. It looked out of place among the wrenches and spark plugs. Then he looked at the major. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag, waiting for the punchline. Thought it was a joke, an officer's bad sense of humor. "Sir," Hackleton asked, a confused smile on his face, "you want to carry it inside the cockpit to shoot out the window like a drive-by?" "No," Carpenter said. He didn't smile back. "I want you to mount it on the wing, on the struts, and not just one. I want 6, 3 on each side." Silence filled the tent. The sound of rain drumming on the canvas roof seemed to get louder. The other mechanics stopped working. They put down their tools. They stared at Carpenter like he had grown a second head. Hackleton laughed nervously. The smile vanished from his face. "Major, with all due respect, you've lost your mind. That plane is an L-4. It's built for observation. It's made of wood and doped fabric. It's basically a flying tent. It's flammable." He picked up the bazooka and gestured with it, pointing the open end toward the tent wall. "This thing, when it fires, it expels a backblast of flame and hot gas for 20 feet behind it, on the ground. That flame hits the dirt. In the air, if you mount this on the strut, that flame is going to hit the underside of your wing." Hackleton leaned in, his face grim, his eyes pleading. "Sir, doped fabric is highly flammable. It's like gasoline soaked into cloth. If you pull the trigger, you won't destroy a tank. You will set your own plane on fire. You will burn alive before you even see the rocket hit the target." It was a valid point, a terrifying point. The L-4 was essentially made of kindling and glue. Fire was the pilot's worst nightmare. A fire in the air meant death. There were no parachutes at this altitude, but Carpenter didn't blink. He had seen too many men die on the ground to worry about his own safety anymore. "I've done the math, Sergeant," Carpenter lied. He hadn't done any math. He was going on gut instinct and desperation. "The slipstream, the wind from the propeller, it will blow the fire back before it catches. It will work." Hackleton shook his head violently. "It's against regulations, sir. The colonel will never approve it. It's a suicide pact." Carpenter stepped closer. He lowered his voice. "The colonel doesn't have to know, not yet. And as for suicide, those boys down there in the mud are committing suicide every day against those tigers. I'm going to help them now. Are you going to help me wire this up? Or do I have to do it myself?" There was a long pause. The tension in the tent was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Hackleton sighed. He threw his rag on the bench with a wet slap. A small, reluctant smile crept onto his face. He realized the major was serious, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea was exactly what they needed to break the stalemate. Well, the mechanic said, grabbing a wrench, if we're going to get court-martialed, we might as well do a good job. Bring the plane in, Major. And so, the work began. It wasn't high-tech engineering. It wasn't done by scientists in white coats. It was barnyard engineering. It was American ingenuity at its rawest. They worked through the night, under the light of dim lanterns, hiding their work from the brass. They didn't have custom mounts. They didn't have wind tunnel data. They had baling wire, heavy-duty duct tape, and simple electrical cords scavenged from broken lamps. They stripped the bazookas down to the bone. They removed the wooden stocks, the optical sights, the trigger mechanisms. Anything to save weight. They were left with 6 bare, ugly, steel tubes. They hoisted them up to the delicate wing struts. They used metal hose clamps to secure them, 3 on the left, 3 on the right. They angled them slightly downward, guessing the trajectory, so that the rockets would converge at a point about 100 yards in front of the plane. Wiring the trigger was the hardest part. They ran electrical wires from the rockets along the struts, carefully taping them down, through a hole drilled in the plexiglass window, and into the cockpit. Carpenter didn't have a sophisticated gun sight. He didn't have a firing computer. He rigged a simple row of toggle switches on a wooden board and taped it to his dashboard, right next to the throttle. Switch 1 for the left wing, switch 2 for the right, by the time they were finished. It was morning. The sun was coming up over the misty fields of France, casting long shadows across the tarmac. They pushed the plane out of the hangar. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's toy that had been vandalized. The sleek lines of the Grasshopper were ruined by the ugly clusters of steel tubes hanging under the wings. It looked heavy. It looked awkward. It looked like something that shouldn't be able to fly. Other pilots came out of the barracks, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Holding mugs of coffee, they stopped. They stared, and then they started laughing. "Hey, Charlie," one pilot shouted, pointing at the tubes. "What are you going to do with that? Go rabbit hunting." "Hey, Major, make sure you bring a parachute. You're gonna blow your own wings off." "Look, it's the secret weapon, the flying junkyard." They called it Carpenter's folly. They called it a death trap. Even the base commander came out, took one look, and shook his head in disbelief. He didn't stop him. Mostly because he didn't think the plane would even get off the ground. He thought physics would stop Carpenter before the Germans did. But Carpenter ignored them. He ignored the laughter. He ignored the doubts. He walked around the plane, inspecting the wires one last time. He patted the fabric fuselage. He grabbed a bucket of white paint and a brush. On the nose of the plane, in crude, hand-painted letters, he wrote a name. A name that would soon strike terror into the hearts of the German panzer divisions. Rosie the Rocketer. He climbed into the cockpit. It was cramped. The extra switches and wires made it feel like a mad scientist's lab. He strapped himself in. He put on his leather helmet and goggles. He looked at Hackleton, who was standing by the propeller, looking worried. The mechanic gave him a thumbs up, but his eyes said, "Please don't die." "Clear prop," Carpenter shouted. Hackleton swung the blade. The little 65 horsepower engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. The plane vibrated. The bazooka tubes shook on their mounts. Carpenter released the brakes. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane moved, but it was heavy, so heavy. The extra weight of the 6 steel tubes and the live rockets inside them acted like an anchor. The plane waddled down the runway like a fat duck. It gathered speed, agonizingly slowly, 40 miles per hour, 50. The end of the runway was coming up fast. A line of tall poplar trees loomed ahead. If he didn't lift off soon, he would crash into them. "Come on, Rosie," Carpenter whispered through clenched teeth. "Come on, girl, fly." He pulled back on the stick for a terrifying second. Nothing happened. The wheels stayed glued to the mud, and then, with a groan of protest, the wings bit into the air. The wheels lifted 6 inches, 1 foot, 10 feet. He cleared the trees by a margin of inches. It was airborne, but flying was the easy part. The hard part was firing. Carpenter climbed to 1,000 feet. The plane handled like a brick. The aerodynamic drag from the tubes was immense. It felt like he was flying with the parking brake on, but he had altitude. He scanned the ground below. He needed a target, not a tank, not yet. He needed something soft to test the system. He needed to know if firing the rockets would destroy his own plane. There, on a dirt road near a farmhouse, he saw a German armored car. It was an SD, KFZ 222, a light reconnaissance vehicle. It was moving fast, kicking up dust. It wasn't a Tiger, but it was German. And it was armored. This was it. The moment of truth. Carpenter pushed the stick forward. He didn't dive steeply. He couldn't. The wings might rip off from the stress. He went into a shallow, gliding dive. The wind screamed through the open bazooka tubes like a banshee, a howling, terrifying sound. He lined up the armored car in his crude sight. He estimated the range, 200 yards. His finger hovered over the first toggle switch. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The mechanic's warning echoed in his mind. You will set the fabric on fire. You will burn alive if the backblast curled around the wing. The dope on the fabric would ignite like gasoline. He would be a falling comet in seconds. There would be no bailing out at this altitude. He took a deep breath. He steadied his hand. Here goes nothing, he whispered, and he flipped the switch. Whoosh, the sensation was violent. A cloud of white smoke instantly engulfed the cockpit. The plane shuddered as the rocket left the tube. Carpenter couldn't see. He was blind. He flinched, waiting for the heat, waiting for the smell of burning fabric, waiting for the wing to snap. 1 second, 2 seconds. The wind cleared the smoke. He looked left. The wing was still there. It was black with soot. The fabric was scorched. But it wasn't burning. It held. He looked down. The rocket had struck the road just behind the armored car. It wasn't a direct hit, but the explosion had been close enough. The armored car had swerved off the road and rolled over into a ditch. German soldiers were scrambling out, running for cover. It worked. A wave of pure adrenaline washed over Carpenter. He threw his head back and laughed, a wild, triumphant laugh that nobody could hear over the engine. It works. He screamed into his radio, his voice cracking with emotion. Hackelton, you beautiful son of a gun, it works. He circled back, fired 2 more rockets just to be sure, and then headed for home. When he landed, the mood on the airfield changed instantly. The mockery was gone, the laughter died. Pilots and mechanics ran to the plane. They ran their fingers over the scorched wings. They looked at the empty tubes, and then they looked at Carpenter. He wasn't the crazy school teacher anymore. He was something else. He was a pioneer. He had proven them all wrong, but Carpenter knew this was just the beginning. An armored car was one thing. A Tiger tank was a god. To kill a tiger, he would need to get closer, he would need to be perfect, and he would need to be lucky. The Germans weren't going to let a paper plane humiliate them. They would be waiting. The real hunt was about to begin. September 20th, 1944. The Battle of Aracourt had begun. It was the largest, most violent tank battle the United States Army had ever fought on the Western Front. In the rolling hills and thick, misty forests of the Lorraine region, the war had turned into a chaotic brawl. American Sherman tanks, outgunned and under-armored, were clashing head-on with superior German Panthers and Tigers. The ground shook with the constant impact of high-explosive shells. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning diesel, charred steel, and wet earth. It was a meat grinder. The fog was so thick you could barely see 50 yards in front of you. It was a day for dying. Major Charles Carpenter was in the air that morning. The weather was terrible, low clouds, heavy mist, and intermittent rain made flying the fragile L-4 almost suicidal. The visibility was poor. Most pilots were grounded. The fighter bombers, the P-47s that the ground troops relied on, were stuck at their airfields, unable to take off. But Carpenter wasn't most pilots, and Rosie the Rocketer wasn't a normal plane. He was patrolling the misty forests near the town of Aracourt, flying at treetop level, searching for trouble. His little 65-horsepower engine droned on, a steady, rhythmic hum that was the only sound in the damp cockpit. He wiped the condensation off his windshield with a gloved hand. He scanned the ground, looking for movement in the shadows. He looked for the telltale tracks of heavy armor in the mud. Suddenly, through a break in the trees, he saw them, a column of German armor. They were moving silently along a muddy logging road, hidden from the main highway. They were moving into position to ambush an American tank destroyer unit that was completely unaware of their presence. The Americans were exposed, they were vulnerable, and leading the German column, like a medieval king leading his army, was a Tiger I tank. Carpenter felt a chill run down his spine, even from the air. Even from the safety of altitude. It looked terrifying. It looked like a moving fortress. Its massive, boxy hull was covered in zimmerit, a rough, cement-like paste used to prevent magnetic mines from sticking. Its long 88mm gun was traversing slowly, hunting for prey. It was a machine designed for one purpose, to kill, and right now it was hunting Americans. Carpenter grabbed his radio mic. His hands were steady. But his heart was pounding against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He tried to call for air support. He tried to call for the artillery. This is Rosie. I have eyes on a Tiger column. Sector 47 requesting immediate fire mission. Static, just the hiss of white noise. The hills were blocking the signal. The atmospheric interference from the storm was too strong. Repeat, I have a visual on German heavy armor, flanking maneuver, I need support. Now. Nothing. The radio was dead. Or maybe the artillery batteries were already overwhelmed. Carpenter looked down. He saw the Tiger tank rotating its turret toward the unsuspecting Americans. He saw the muzzle break of the 88 in less than 5 minutes. That gun would open fire, and dozens of American soldiers would die. He was the only one who could stop it. Carpenter looked at the Tiger. Then, he looked out at his flimsy fabric wings. He saw the bazooka tubes vibrating in the wind. The rain was dripping off the warheads. He had 6 rockets, 3 on each side. The Tiger had 4 inches of frontal armor. A bazooka rocket couldn't penetrate the front. It would just bounce off like a tennis ball. Even the side armor was thick enough to stop a rocket unless the angle was perfect. But Carpenter knew football, he knew strategy, and he knew that every defense, no matter how strong, has a weak spot. The Tiger was invincible from the front. It was strong on the sides, but from the top. The armor on the engine deck and the turret roof was thin, less than an inch of steel. If he could hit it there, if he could drop a shaped charge right on top of that engine, he could kill it, but to hit the top, he couldn't fire from a distance. He couldn't fire from a safe angle. He had to dive, he had to get vertical, and he had to get close, suicidally close. He had to fly a fabric plane directly into the teeth of machine gun fire. Carpenter took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He thought about his wife back home. He thought about his students on the football field. And then, he thought about the American boys in the mud below, about to be massacred. Not today, he whispered to himself. Not on my watch. He pulled the stick back and climbed. He needed altitude. He needed energy. The little engine groaned as he forced it upward. He climbed to 1,500 feet. He circled around, positioning himself directly behind the German column. The sun, what little there was of it through the clouds, was behind him. He pushed the stick forward. He didn't just dive, he plummeted. The L-4 screamed toward the earth. The little engine revved past its red line. The fabric covering on the wings rippled and popped under the strain. The wires hummed a deadly tune. He was coming down at an 80-degree angle, a dive bomber attack. In a plane that wasn't built to dive, the wind noise was deafening. It roared through the struts. It whistled through the gaps in the door. The German tank commander heard the engine. It was a high-pitched whine that was getting louder every second. He popped his head out of the hatch. He looked up. What he saw must have confused him. It wasn't a fighter plane. It wasn't a bomber. It was a tiny, olive-drab observation plane, falling out of the sky like a stone. It looked like it was crashing. It looked like a leaf falling from a tree. The commander didn't fire. Didn't move. He just watched, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of it. He couldn't process what he was seeing. A scout plane attacking a Tiger. It was impossible. It was a joke. Carpenter waited 1,000 feet. The ground was rushing up to meet him. The trees were growing larger, 800 feet. The Tiger grew larger in his windshield. He could see the commander's face. He could see the black cross painted on the steel. He could see the mud on the tracks. 500 feet. The wind was screaming. The struts were vibrating so hard he thought the wings would tear off. The G-force was pushing him into his seat. Steady, steady, Carpenter muttered through clenched teeth. His hand hovered over the toggle switches. 300 feet, he was staring death in the face. He was so close he could see the rivets on the tank's turret. He flipped the switches. 1, 2, 3, 4, whoosh, 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 whoosh. 4 rockets streaked out from the wings in a ripple of fire and smoke. The plane shuddered as the weight dropped. Carpenter yanked back on the stick with both hands. He pulled up so hard his vision went gray. The little plane groaned under the G-force. The wheels skimmed the treetops, clipping the branches. He was flying inches above the German heads behind him. There was a moment of silence, and then, a thunderclap, boom, 2 of the rockets missed. They exploded harmlessly in the mud, kicking up fountains of dirt. But two of them found their mark. They slammed into the top of the Tiger's engine deck and the turret roof. The shaped charges detonated instantly. A jet of molten metal, burning at 3,000 degrees, burned through the thin roof armor like a hot knife through butter. It ignited the fuel tanks. It ignited the ammunition storage. The 60-ton monster shuddered violently. A massive fireball erupted from the hatches. The turret, weighing 11 tons, was lifted into the air by the force of the internal explosion. It crashed back down onto the hull with a bone-shattering clang. It was a catastrophic kill. The German column stopped dead. The other tanks began to panic. They started firing their machine guns into the sky, wildly, blindly. They didn't know what had hit them. They thought they were under attack by a squadron of P-47s. They thought they were being hit by heavy artillery. They didn't realize, they couldn't conceive, that they had just been dismantled by a history teacher in a kite. Carpenter circled back. He looked down at the burning wreck. The Tiger was finished. It was a bonfire. The ambush was broken. The American troops were safe. He keyed his mic again. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. His heart was pounding like a drum in his chest, but his voice was calm, almost bored. "Base," he said. "This is Rosie, Scratch 1 Tiger. I'm coming home for reload." When he landed, the news had already spread. The infantrymen had seen it. They had seen the little plane dive. They had seen the Tiger explode. The word went up the line like wildfire. "The Mad Major just killed a Tiger." General Patton himself heard about it. The general, who rarely had anything good to say about observation pilots, reportedly laughed out loud and said, "That son of a bitch is crazy. I want to meet him." Carpenter became a celebrity. The press picked up the story. Stars and Stripes wrote about him. They called him the Mad Major. The Germans called him the Crazy American. They put a bounty on his head. They wanted him dead, but he wasn't done. He had tasted blood, and now he wanted more. He started hunting. He didn't wait for targets of opportunity anymore. He went looking for them. He destroyed armored cars. He destroyed half-tracks. He destroyed supply trucks. He became the terror of the German supply lines, but his favorite target was always the tanks. By the end of 1944, Carpenter had officially destroyed 4 German tanks, but his greatest battle, and his closest brush with death, was yet to come because the Germans were adapting. They knew about the bazooka plane now. They were sick of being humiliated. They had orders to shoot it down on sight. They set traps. They deployed flak wagons, mobile anti-aircraft guns specifically to hunt him. Carpenter was flying into a hornet's nest, and one day, his luck was going to run out by October 1944. The name Bazooka Charlie had become a ghost story among the German troops. He was a phantom, a demon in a fabric kite. He struck without warning, destroyed the pride of the Wehrmacht, and vanished before they could fire a shot. But the Germans were not stupid, and they were not helpless. The German High Command issued a standing order to every anti-aircraft unit in the sector: shoot down the bazooka plane at all costs. They put a bounty on his head. They were tired of being humiliated by a flying bicycle, so they stopped hiding. They started setting traps. They deployed flak wagons, mobile 20mm anti-aircraft guns mounted on the back of trucks. They camouflaged them with branches and nets. They hid them in the dense tree lines along the supply routes, and they waited. They knew Carpenter couldn't resist a target. They knew he would come for them. Carpenter was flying into a hornet's nest. He knew the odds were stacking against him. He knew that in this game, you only have to be unlucky once. One afternoon, the sky was a bruised purple color. The rain had stopped for a moment, leaving the air crisp and clear. Carpenter was hunting near the Saar River. He was alone. He spotted movement on a secondary road, a German supply convoy, trucks, half-tracks, and fuel tankers. It looked like a juicy target. It looked unprotected. It looked too easy. Carpenter hesitated. His instincts, honed by months of combat, were screaming at him, something is wrong, but the fuel tankers were a high-value target. If he could destroy them, he could stop the Panzer tanks from moving. He made his choice. He pushed the stick forward. He began his dive. 1,000 feet, 800 feet. The wind rushed through the struts, and then the trap snapped shut from the dark edge of the forest. 4 20mm flak guns opened fire at simultaneously. Boom, 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 boom. The air around the tiny plane instantly turned into a black cloud of exploding steel. It didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like he was inside a metal drum being beaten with sledgehammers. Shrapnel tore through the fabric wings like they were made of wet tissue paper. A jagged piece of hot steel smashed through the plexiglass windshield, missing Carpenter's head by less than 2 inches. It embedded itself in the instrument panel, sizzling with heat. The plane shuddered violently. Like a bird that had been shot in mid-flight, the engine sputtered, coughed, and then started spewing thick, black, oily smoke. The cockpit filled with the choking smell of burning oil and cordite. "Mayday, mayday," Carpenter shouted into his radio, fighting to hear himself over the roar of the explosions. "This is Rosie. I am hit bad, taking heavy fire, going down." He fought the stick. It felt mushy in his hands, disconnected. The control cables were damaged. The rudder was hanging by a thread. The plane wanted to roll over and die. It wanted to spin into the ground. He was losing altitude fast. 400 feet, 300 feet below him, through the smoke. He could see the German soldiers running out from the tree line. They were running toward the field where they expected him to crash. They had rifles in their hands. They were cheering. They wanted him alive or dead. They didn't care. They just wanted the trophy. Carpenter looked at them. He felt a surge of cold, hard anger. "Not today," he gritted out through his teeth. "You don't get me today." He pulled back on the stick with all his remaining strength. His knuckles turned white. His muscles burned. "Come on, Rosie," he whispered to the machine. "Don't quit on me now, not here. Get us home, girl, just get us home." The little plane groaned under the strain. It was bleeding oil. It was losing power. The fabric on the left wing was flapping in the wind, shredded, but somehow. Miraculously, the little 65-horsepower engine didn't die. It coughed, it wheezed, it rattled, but it kept turning. Carpenter leveled out just feet above the ground. He skimmed over the treetops, his wheels clipping the highest branches of the oaks. German bullets zipped past the fuselage like angry hornets, punching more holes in the fabric. Zip, zip, zip. He stayed low. He used the terrain to mask his escape. He flew down ravines, behind hills. Anywhere the flak guns couldn't track him for 20 minutes. He wrestled with the dying plane. Hot oil sprayed into his face, blinding him. The wind whistled through the shattered windshield, freezing his skin. His arms were shaking from the effort of keeping the wings level. Finally, ahead of him, he saw the muddy strip of the American airfield. It looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He didn't have enough power to circle. He had one shot at landing. He lined up. He cut the throttle. The engine seized and died completely. The propeller stopped dead in the wind. The silence was sudden and terrifying. He was a glider now, a heavy, broken glider. The wheels touched the mud. The plane bounced, skidded, and ground to a halt just feet from the maintenance tent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Carpenter just sat there. His hands were frozen to the stick. He couldn't unclench them. He was covered in oil and sweat. He was shaking uncontrollably. The mechanics ran out to the plane. They arrived with fire extinguishers, expecting a blaze, but when they saw the plane, they stopped dead in their tracks. They dropped their tools. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Rosie the Rocketer was shredded. They started counting. 1, 10, 20, 50. They counted over 50 bullet and shrapnel holes in the fuselage and wings. The main spar of the left wing was cracked almost in half. The tail was held on by a few twisted strands of wire. By all the laws of physics, that plane should have disintegrated in mid-air. It should have been a smoking hole in the ground. Hackleton, the crew chief, climbed up on the strut. He looked into the cockpit. He saw Carpenter sitting there, staring straight ahead with a 1,000-yard stare. "Major," Hackleton asked softly. "Major, are you hit?" Carpenter blinked. He slowly turned his head. He pulled off his oil-soaked goggles. The skin around his eyes was white, contrasting with the black oil on his face. He reached into his flight suit pocket with a trembling hand. He pulled out a pack of crushed cigarettes. He put one in his mouth. He tried to light it, but his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't get the flame to the tip. Hackleton reached in and lit it for him. Carpenter took a deep drag. He held the smoke in his lungs for a long time, and then let it out. He looked at his broken, ruined plane. He looked at the holes that had almost killed him. He looked at the sky where he had almost died, and then a slow, crooked smile spread across his face. "Patch her up, boys," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "We have work to do tomorrow." Hackleton stared at him. "Sir, she's totaled. The wing is cracked. The engine is cooked. She's done." Carpenter looked at the mechanic. The fire was back in his eyes. "Then get me a new wing," Carpenter said. "Get me a new engine, scavenge parts from the wrecks. I don't care, just get her flying." And they did. They worked through the night. They patched the holes with new fabric. They replaced the engine. They wired the wings back together, and the next day, Charles Carpenter was back in the air, back on the hunt. He kept flying. He kept fighting. He refused to rotate home. He refused to take a desk job. He had started something, and he was going to finish it. By the time the war ended in May of 1945, Major Charles Carpenter, the history teacher from Illinois, had officially destroyed 6 German tanks, including 2 massive Tiger tanks. He had also destroyed dozens of armored cars, trucks, and command vehicles. Think about that for a second. Let it sink in. A man flying a plane made of wood and cloth with a top speed of 70 miles per hour had more confirmed tank kills than many tank commanders in heavy Sherman tanks. He had faced the most terrifying weapons of the Nazi war machine, and he had won for his bravery. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters, and the Bronze Star. He became a legend in the Third Army, a folk hero to the infantrymen who cheered every time they saw Rosie buzzing overhead. But the war took its toll, the stress, the exposure to the freezing cold, the constant brush with death. It leaves a mark on a man. The guns eventually fell silent. The Nazis surrendered. The world celebrated. Carpenter went home. He tried to go back to his normal life. But fate had one last battle in store for him. In 1945, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. The Third Reich had crumbled into dust. The monsters, the tigers and the panthers, were now just rusting hulks of metal littering the roadsides of France and Germany. Major Charles Carpenter, the Mad Major, hung up his flight suit. He put away his leather helmet and his goggles. He left the mud and the blood behind him. He returned to the quiet, tree-lined streets of Urbana, Illinois. He tried to go back to being just Charles. He went back to the classroom. He picked up his history books. He blew his whistle on the football field. To his students, he wasn't a tank killer. He was just coach. He was the guy who taught them about the Civil War and how to throw a spiral pass. He rarely spoke about the war. He didn't brag. He didn't tell stories about diving vertically at 88mm cannons. He just wanted peace, but fate, it seems, wasn't done with him yet. Fate had one last battle in store for the history teacher, and this time, the enemy wasn't made of steel, it was inside him. In 1945, shortly after returning home, Carpenter fell ill. He felt tired, weak. The doctors ran tests. They looked at the results with grim faces. The diagnosis was Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymphatic system. In 1945, this was a death sentence. The treatments were primitive. The survival rate was almost zero. The doctors sat him down and told him the hard truth. "Charles," they said gently, "you have 2 years, maybe less. Go home, put your affairs in order." 2 years, most men would have crumpled. Most men would have given up. But the doctors didn't know who they were talking to. They were talking to the man who strapped bazookas to a kite. They were talking to the man who looked a tiger tank in the eye and didn't blink. Carpenter treated the cancer just like he treated the Wehrmacht. He refused to accept its authority. He refused to let it dictate his life. He didn't quit his job. He didn't stop coaching. He kept teaching. He kept living. He fought the disease with a quiet, stubborn ferocity that baffled the medical experts. 2 years passed. He was still alive. 5 years, 10 years. He lived to see his students grow up. He lived to see the world change. He fought that final battle for 21 years. Charles Carpenter finally passed away in 1966. At the age of 53, he died peacefully. A quiet hero who had defied the odds until his very last breath. But what about the plane? What about Rosie the Rocketer? For decades, historians thought she was lost. They thought she had been scrapped in Europe, turned into aluminum pots and pans like thousands of other warbirds. She was just a memory in a few grainy black and white photographs. But in 2017, a miracle happened. In a dusty hangar in Austria, a group of aviation archaeologists found an old, battered L-4 Grasshopper. It had been sold as surplus after the war. It had been used by a Swiss flying club. It had been crashed, repaired, and forgot. But when they stripped away the layers of civilian paint, they found something underneath. They found the original olive drab military skin, and there, faint but unmistakable, were the bullet holes, the scars of the Saar River Valley, and on the wing struts, they found the crude, hand-drilled mounting holes where the bazookas had once been wired. It was her, it was Rosie. She was brought back to the United States. The Collings Foundation spent years lovingly restoring her. They found original 1944 fabric. They found vintage bazookas. They restored every bolt, every wire, every scar. Today, Rosie the Rocketer flies again. If you go to an air show, you might see her, a tiny, fragile, olive drab plane buzzing overhead. She doesn't roar like a Mustang. She doesn't scream like a jet. She just hums. But when people look up and see those steel tubes strapped to her wings, they stop talking. They stare in awe, because that little plane represents something powerful. It represents the spirit of the underdog. It reminds us that you don't need the thickest armor to win. You don't need the biggest gun. You don't need the fastest engine. Sometimes, all you need is a stupid idea, some bailing wire, and the absolute refusal to give up. Major Charles Carpenter wasn't a superhero. He was a teacher. He was a coach. He was an ordinary man who looked at an impossible situation and decided to change the rules of the game. The Germans laughed at his paper plane. They called him crazy. But in the end, the history teacher taught the Nazis a lesson they would never, ever forget. So, the next time someone tells you that your idea is stupid or that your goal is impossible, just remember Bazooka Charlie. Remember the man who hunted tigers in a kite. If you enjoyed this incredible story of American ingenuity and courage, please do me a favor. Smash that like button. It helps us dig up more forgotten heroes from the dusty archives of history and keep their memories alive. And I want to hear from you in the comments. This is the debate of the century. If you were in World War II, would you rather be safe inside the heavy armor of a 60-ton Tiger tank? Or would you take your chances in a paper plane with a bazooka? Let me know your choice below. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. We'll see you in the next one.